The lecture I selected for October 2021 is Pleasure, the Full Pulsation of Life. It follows work on, it's Pathwork Lecture 177. It follows work on Pathwork Lecture 175 on consciousness. The lectures around this number area seem to be of great interest or usefulness to the groups that I lead. Pleasure is easily misunderstood. Pleasure, the four subtopics that I set up were pleasure being a legitimate need, legitimate human need. Second, the principle of pleasure. Third, bliss as the spiritual level of pleasure. And the fourth concerns obstructions to pleasure, which includes the phrase, I can't, concealing a negative intent or negativity of I won't. So the victim consciousness cannot bring you to pleasure when you are empowered, when you find your own power and learn to use it according to beliefs that are aligned with spiritual truth. That's how you find real pleasure. Other kinds of pleasure can be misunderstood. They can be superficial. They can be momentarily pleasing. But the guide's use of the word pleasure is very specific. So there's a summary in the study guide about what pleasure is and what it isn't. I'm going to focus right now just on what pleasure isn't. The type of pleasure that we're speaking of here is not ego-based. It is not disconnected from spirituality as you perceive it, whether that is God, a belief system, spirit plane, higher power. Pleasure is not pleasurable pastimes, shallow escapes, or substitutes. Those are really distractions. There's nothing wrong with a distraction. A good distraction will get you through a tough time. But this topic is pleasure, deep, abiding pleasure. So it's not a shallow substitute for it. If pleasure is ego-based, for instance, card games become competitive. They are negative. They become dualistic. I win, you win. But if they're pleasurable, card games can become vehicles for connection. You've all experienced times when the same activity can be very connecting, very nourishing, very loving. And then at another time, it can become charged and negative and divisive between people. Same activity, same involvement with the activity. But the pleasure of the activity is from what happens because of it, not the activity itself. It's not the vehicle for pleasure that we're concerned about. It's the underlying cause of pleasure, which is alignment with spiritual truth and values. You can get negative pleasure if you have pleasure at the expense of another human being. Once again, card games, where it's ego gratification or triumph. You can have pretend pleasures, such as being in defense and saying, there, you see, I'm safe. It's a childish pretense of pleasure. And pleasure is not dependency. It is not, you will take care of me and therefore I will be in bliss, I will be in pleasure. That's not the kind of pleasure we're talking about. So in the second section on the pleasure principle, the guide repeats that the pleasure that they're talking about here is a total experience, not a divided experience. It is not a physical experience with the spiritual part left out, nor is it a spiritual state that does not include the physical state. So pleasure is a human experience. And that's why in the third section, I talk about bliss. Bliss is the spiritual form of pleasure. It is more intense. The word itself is more intense and more involving and more complete and more like ecstasy, because we're not carrying around the human form. So pleasure is how we integrate bliss with humanity, bliss with being a human being. As I sit and speak to you, I may feel pleasure at attempting to communicate and pleasure at feeling that I'm doing a job of value, and my feet can still hurt. I can still feel distractions where I hear things on the outside and I have to focus my words. It can be pleasure without being complete. An experience can be pleasurable and imperfect. Bliss is not imperfect. Bliss is total and complete ecstasy. And perhaps you can see where we can get moments of that. But that's not, the phrase I use is, that's not where we live. So we can visit and then we have to come back. The idea is that as long as you are a human being, you need to come back and you need to enjoy coming back. There's work to be done here. There's pleasure to be had here. And there are moments of bliss that can exist while we're in human form on the planet between people. If we don't demand that bliss is all we have, which is a childish demand, then bliss comes and goes. The Pathwork lecture on Eros speaks of this in the same way, that Eros comes and goes. It's a beautiful and wonderful thing to feel the call of your soul and to want to float out into the universe and do things. That's not all of life. It's a part of life. So Eros eventually fades and you deal with the nuts and bolts of how do you get through your day and what do you do about this new activity that Eros has led you to. So bliss as the spiritual level of pleasure is something that we can participate, share, understand, taste of. But as long as we're on the earth, that's not where we're going to stay. Perhaps one of the reasons for drug addictions is that drugs can give the artificial sense of being in bliss. It's used a lot in storytelling where someone, when they try to describe why someone would give away their life, destroy their family, kill, maim, steal for a drug experience. Why would you do that? If a drug experience, I'm trying to find the word here. If a drug experience mimics spiritual bliss in all the ways that you can understand it, it is understandable that you would never want to give that up. But in not giving that up, you're destroying your human experience, destroying your body, destroying your family relationships, destroying your career, your motivation, your ability to participate in human activities. So it becomes an all or nothing when we go into bliss artificially and demand to stay there. We're saying we don't want to be human. So the guide says that it is therefore correct to say that spiritual unfoldment must bring an increase of pleasure without necessarily denial and sacrifice of pleasure. So there's an idea here that if you have to be human, it has to be miserable and awful. It doesn't have to be miserable and awful, but like not being in bliss all the time, you won't be in pleasure all the time. So a lot of moralistic and religion-based strictures against pleasure are about being seduced away from spiritual pursuits, but they can coexist. It takes some work to coexist them because pleasure can exist without spiritual alignment. But instead of trying to harness and correct pleasure, there are religious teachings and that say just don't have pleasure. If you don't have pleasure, you don't have the temptation. And then you will have all your energy available for spiritual alignment. But who wants to do that? It's work. It's work and drudgery. And pleasure can increase your capacity to do spiritual work. So once again, the divisiveness, the all or nothing, one or the other, usually indicates a misunderstanding of a spiritual principle. The lecture teaches that bliss is the natural state of being. It may be the natural state of being, but that does not mean that you belong there all the time. That is once again a misunderstanding. Now, when we talk about pleasure and bliss, I like to encourage people to focus on what they often overlook. The kind of pleasure that can be trivialized or ignored, or because it is actually pleasure and has no pain or distraction involved, we don't remember it. So my invitation is to remember small moments, or to become aware when you're in such a small moment. Feeling of satisfaction after a job is completed. I always like the smell of fresh laundry. I like the smell of fresh laundry. It fades, and I don't use artificial stuff to make my laundry smell like flowers for weeks on end. But there is a quality to freshness, to cleanliness, to lack of smells. There's a lovely sense of starting over or beginning again that is very pleasurable. There is pleasure in just looking up at the sky without worrying about whether it's going to turn orange the next day or whether it's going to rain tomorrow, but simply looking up at the sky. The sky is a beautiful thing. It is also charged with energy, and without realizing it, we appreciate energy. We understand energy on a part of us that isn't always conscious. What a lot of spiritual modalities are about, becoming conscious of energy. I could name many more, but you get the idea. When you get dressed and you get ready for something and you stand and say, I am ready. I am aligned. There's pleasure in that. There's pleasure in being ready for a task. In that moment before you begin the task. These are the kinds of moments of pleasure that we don't remember, we don't notice, we don't bookmark. My invitation to you is to bookmark pleasure and realize how much you've got in your life. If it's fleeting, that may be true, but you can, once you put it into your conscious mind, savor it. You can bring it back up again and savor it again. So my encouragement is to make a list of pleasures, simple pleasures. You may make a list and then have to prune some out, realizing they're not really pleasure, they're more distraction, but that's okay. You make the list and then you prune it. Even the moment of saying, wow, that's an interesting list, is a moment of pleasure. Look at that. I've created a list and it is pleasurable. These are all aligned. There's a sense of satisfaction, of completion. But you see, if you held on to a sense of completion, you wouldn't go on to the next task. And that's where substitutes want to give you more permanent, more long-lasting experiences of pleasure. They just want to extend that moment for a longer time. That's not really pleasure. That's an artificiality. Real pleasure comes and goes, and it's like a bird in your hand. If you keep it and hold it, it will die. It will fade. Real pleasure is, what just came into my mind is the idea of a bird landing on my shoulder or my hand. I would want to hold my breath and not do anything and savor that moment because it's odd and special and pleasurable, but it won't last. The bird won't stay because of life. Life is going to continue to go on. So a lot of superficial holding on to pleasure is a desire to stop life. It's actually quite negative. So the last section is about negativity. And Pathwork has been, let me see if I can, it's nice to be diplomatic. Pathwork has been called out for focusing on the negative. And there's truth to that. I won't run away from it. If you have an ongoing experience of multiple pleasures that aren't negative, then there's nothing to worry about. Most of us have some interference with that. And the interference is because of negativity that we haven't recognized. So Pathwork's focus is on finding the negativity so that you can go back to experiencing pleasure with fewer negative distractions without being unaligned with spirit because you're engaging in negativity. To do that, you have to see the negativity. So a lot of our focus is on seeing the negative, taking it apart, understanding it, and releasing our attachment to it, our unconscious attachment, our misunderstanding attachment to it. So in this last section, I talk about negativity, or I chose sections of the lecture about negativity and negative intent. And I highlighted the phrases I can't versus I won't. There is a child consciousness aspect of I can't. I can't. It's identifiable because that's really a cry for help. I can't is looking around for, I can't, can you? I can't, can you help me? There's a positive intent there, a statement, I can't do this by myself. So I can't is not inherently, automatically a problem. It's a problem when it's used to cover up, I don't want to. I won't. So I can't is offered up as an excuse that a lot of people would readily accept. Oh, I'm sorry, you can't do that. And the truth is I could, but I don't want to put in the extra effort to do so. So perhaps you can see the negativity that hides under socially acceptable phrases like, well, I can't. So it can be an honest cry for help and it can be a cover-up. I won't is more honest. When we say I won't, this uncovers our illusion that we can single-handedly negate life. I won't uncovers my desire to be the block. I want to be the block. I want to stop something. I won't, and you can't make me. And because I won't, things won't move ahead. Things will move ahead without you. But there's an illusion that your negativity, our decision not to cooperate can stop something from happening. It does for us. It may not for anyone else. So the idea is that to say, when you say I can't, make sure that that's an honest phrase and that it's I can't, can you? Can anyone? Is there a solution? That when you use I can't, that's your intent. If it's not, to look underneath and see whether I can't is hiding an I won't. And again, that the ability to see the I won't, to see that negative intent, allows you to then work with it and free it so that you're not blocking your own efforts. You're not being the stubborn last person to agree. So that you can move ahead, you can interact with people, you can interact with circumstances, and you can potentially create something you do want to participate in. So that's why this last section concentrates on I won't. You may see on the paperwork that I've decided again to call this part 1 without necessarily having the intention to do a part 2. And my reason for that is I got into this lecture and I realized that there was more than I could present in the standard form that I use. So my phrase part 1 is meant to imply there's more in this lecture. And I wish you would read the actual lecture or listen to it. There are free audio presentations of the lectures available on YouTube, graciously donated. They are free and read by Gary Volbrach. And a lot of people that I work with really enjoy being able to play those audio tapes. There are also a certain number, I think the number is 88, audio tapes available of Ava's original transmission. So these can be interesting to hear. So thank you for listening. Thank you for your interest in Pathwork that led you to this 15 or 20 minute YouTube video. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. I did. It's fun, which is, I have to find the fun part in a lecture to feel comfortable presenting it. So thanks for listening and take care.